Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. In the last episode, we talked about the thematic statement, chapter 2, verses 6 to 7, in which Paul laid out the basic format for the rest of the letter. In verse 8, he begins to focus in on what is going to be the focus of this chapter, the philosophy, and how it compares to Christianity. Verse 8 says, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." So, what is the philosophy? The word philosophy just means love of wisdom, and philosophy itself is actually a good thing. It is an attempt to think hard about life and understand the world around you. That's something we should all do. So just because Paul says that the philosophy here is bad, that does not mean that all philosophy is bad, just this particular one. Something else you should know is that in the ancient world, philosophy and religion were not that far apart. They covered a lot of the same subjects, and many philosophies would actually have a lifestyle associated with them. So it was not just an abstract pursuit done by thinking a lot. However, one place where philosophy and religion differed is where they got their information about the world. More often than not, philosophers try to understand the world from the ground up, using nothing but or primarily human sources. Religion, on the other hand, was more top-down. It used nothing but or primarily divine sources. Now, please don't take what I said too far. I am painting in very broad strokes and probably overgeneralizing things. And yes, I know there are exceptions. Do pay attention to that last point, though, because it's important to the discussion we're about to have. This philosophy at Colossae was a bottom-up endeavor, and that was Paul's criticism of it. Paul said that the philosophy at Colossae was according to human tradition and not according to Christ. The philosophy was a man-made attempt to understand the nature of reality and guide one's life. Paul says that the God-given understanding of the nature of reality and the way one should live one's life is better. I should explain, though, that there is nothing wrong with philosophy and similar pursuits that we engage in today. Philosophy is good. We're talking about two different things. I would encourage everyone to study at least some philosophy. Very simply, it will help you think better. What's being argued here is the question, what is the ultimate source of knowledge, truth, and reality? Does it come from man and what he can build from the ground up, or does it come from God and what he reveals to man? You can be a Christian philosopher today, and there are many very good and well-respected Christian philosophers. Paul was not arguing against philosophy today, nor was he even arguing against thinking about philosophy in the ancient world. After all, he had to think about it at least a little to be able to make a comparison with Christianity. He was arguing about the ultimate source of truth. What trumps what? Does what we can know from looking at the world carry the most weight, or does what we can know from God revealing it to us carry the most weight? The best position to take as a Christian is that both are good sources of information, but God is the better source. If there actually is a God who created everything, then we should expect that that God would know something about his creation. However, it is good to study the world around us because there are quite a lot of things that we cannot know from just studying Christianity. For example, we get no scientific advancements from the Bible. So if you like listening to this podcast, you can thank science. Furthermore, sometimes we can easily go astray by thinking that we have the right interpretation of some particular religious text. Looking at the world around us to see whether what we believe actually looks true can help us to know if we're off track. I did a whole series on the intersection of science and Christianity because I think this is a really important topic, and I addressed a number of specific questions there. Right now, I just want to make clear that Paul is not saying that philosophy is bad. He is saying that the attempt by man to build up everything for himself that he needs is misguided and will ultimately fail. Man will never be able to reach up to God. He must accept God's reaching down to him. Okay, think back to the previous episode on verses 6 to 7. Paul did two things that are important here. First, he returned the Colossians' thoughts to the hymn, which is the foundation of theology of the whole letter, and, I argue, for the Christian worldview. Second, he reminded the Colossians of everything that has been done for them by Christ. So, think back to the hymn and everything that we learned about Christ. He is a visible representation of the God who cannot be seen. He acts on behalf of God and fully reveals God. He is the uncreated creator who made everything in creation. He is a place where God and man meet. And he is a reconciler of all things and the one in whom renewal is found. The question that Paul is asking is, if this is your source of information about the true nature of reality, and more importantly, your source of redemption, why would you look anywhere else for these things? Christianity is a top-down approach. It claims to come from God. Obviously, whether or not this is true is another question, and we have talked about that before and will again. The claim, though, is that Christianity is divinely given, and the being who created and is reconciling the world is in a better position to explain reality and guide our existence than anyone else. So, the Colossians should not be taken captive by this philosophy, no matter how convincing it might appear. We need to talk now about something called the stoicheia, which you might see translated as the elemental spirits of the world. Unfortunately, Paul doesn't go into detail about what these forces are. So we can put together a general sort of picture, but it's going to be a little fuzzy. Perhaps the simplest way to explain what they are to modern ears is to call these elemental forces the power of the world, or the powers that be. We might think of them as the sort of impersonal forces that push us around in our lives that we really can't control. Some of these might be powerful people like our bosses or those in government that change the world. Some of these might be the forces of the economy, both good and bad. Some of these might be sickness and death, or birth and new life, and any number of other things that you can think of. Take all of these and put them together, and you'll get a rough idea of what Paul is referring to as the elemental forces of this world. The ancients would have defined them a bit differently. They would have put more of a personal element to them because the spiritual world and the physical world were not separate. That doesn't mean that there aren't spiritual forces behind what we see happening here on earth, see Ephesians 6, but I want to give you something to focus on that's easier to grasp. The simplest thing to do is to think of the forces of this world that we can't control but can and do impact our lives in big ways. In what ways the spiritual world interacts in and outside of those is another discussion, but this should give you the basic idea of what Paul is referring to when he talks about the elemental forces of this world. One thing we do know about the philosophy is that they were trying to escape the control of such forces. In this, they were actually on the same page as Christianity. The philosophers wanted to be able to live free from the control of these forces, and Paul also wanted the Colossians and all Christians to be able to live free from the control of these forces as well. But there's a difference between trying to control your world by performing rituals or placating powers and what Paul suggested. What it really comes down to is that if Christ is in control, you don't have to worry about any other forces or powers or authorities in the earthly world or the spiritual world. That doesn't mean that these forces will no longer exist or impact your life. What that means is that they will no longer control your life. Impact, yes. Control, no. By worrying about how everything around you can negatively affect you, and by trying to control everything, you are demonstrating that you do not believe that Christ is in control. You are trying to control everything yourself. This is something a lot of people struggle with. Paul was telling the Colossians about this nearly 2,000 years ago, and I would argue most of us still struggle with this today, though it looks different in different people. Even if you don't worry about everything, trusting God to take care of things that are outside of your control is still something most of us have trouble with. What Paul is saying is that if Christ really is who Christianity says he is, then we don't need to worry. We don't need to try to control the world around us because there already is someone in control of it. We don't need to worry about what the future will bring. It is already taken care of. That doesn't mean we should just swing the pendulum to the other side and just sit back and do nothing. We should make the best decisions we can and take the best steps we can to move in the right direction. But then, we should let God take over from there. We shouldn't let our lives be consumed with trying to make sure that everything is right. I realize this is a fine line to walk, and many things in life are. Most of the very basic things are black and white. If you ask, should I do this, there will be a very clear yes or no. However, as we mature, less and less things are that simple. There become more and larger areas of gray. Knowing what to do when the world around you is painted in shades of gray takes wisdom. And learning what to do in these situations is part of maturing. The best thing you can do to prepare yourself is to make sure that you understand the basics very well. Colossians is a good letter to study in depth to help you with that because, in it, Paul is giving the reader a high-level view of the basics of the Christian worldview. He is showing the Colossians, and us, how all the pieces fit together. So, if you understand the basics of who God is, who Jesus is, how we relate to Him, and what He wants us to do, you'll be in a much better place to make your way through the places of gray that you find yourself in the future.